I'm Pete Mundo in for Vince Coglianese on WMAL. Happy to welcome on our next guest. Does great work. You should be reading what the folks over at Legal Insurrection are doing, legalinsurrection.com. Bill Jacobsen is the founder. He's also a Cornell Law School professor. He joins us on WMAL on a Friday afternoon. Bill, thanks for joining me. Always appreciate your time. And I want to just start off with President Trump, of course, 2 not guilty pleas in 24 hours. This latest one, it looks like, is tied to new charges Special Counsel Jack Smith brought against him in the mishandling of classified documents case. So you got 2 of these in 24 hours. What's the latest one tied to, and what does it mean?
Well, if it's the one I'm thinking of, it would be the superseding indictment in Florida, which was actually unveiled 2 or 3 weeks ago, but he just entered the plea, I guess, today, which is a formality. And so that added a charge to the Florida case for obstruction of justice that Trump allegedly instructed employees at Mar-a-Lago to destroy or try to erase surveillance footage from Mar-a-Lago, which would have showed presumably things related to these documents. There's no claim that the surveillance footage actually was deleted, but that they tried to delete it and were unsuccessful. So that's the new charge in Florida.
Mm-hmm. And that's the case, Bill, and this has been talked about. But that's, of all these indictments, and I think for most people, the goal here is just to make it so that they know that Trump's in a ton of legal issues. It's going to cost them a lot of money. But if there's one case that may actually have some legs to it, from your perspective, it's that one?
It's that one. I've said that since March. And that's not to say he couldn't be convicted in other ones, but New York case, Manhattan indictment is completely frivolous, abusive. It should get thrown out by a court if he is convicted. It should never have been brought. The one that was just filed in D.C. is obviously much more substantial, but I think is very weak legally because they don't accuse Trump of inciting the act that actually interfered with the congressional counting of electoral votes, which was the riot. That's the curious thing about that indictment is it's like, the elephant in the room that nobody's talking about in the indictment. That was the act that disrupted the counting of votes. He's accused of conspiring to disrupt the counting of votes, but they don't charge him with actually causing the riot, which most people probably don't realize. If you just hear the mainstream news, you'd think he was actually indicted for the January 6th riot, and he wasn't. He was indicted for things that preceded it. And so I don't think that should survive legal challenge, but that's not to say he won't be convicted. And that's the problem here, is that by the time you're vindicated by the appeals court or the Supreme Court, it's 2, 3, 4 years later, and who knows how it affected an election. But I've said since last March on our website that the one I think he has the most substantial exposure to is the records case, the Mar-a-Lago case, because it's the simplest to understand. There's no stretch of legal theories like there is in the other cases. There's no legal, posturing that will probably not survive an appeals court. And it's a relatively simple fact pattern, which is he had documents. We subpoenaed them. He hid them from us. He lied, or he caused others to lie about hiding them from us and giving them back to us. He, had people move boxes around, and he ultimately tried to destroy the, tape recordings. That's what they allege. I'm not saying it's true. They have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's a case that you can understand. There's nothing novel about it. Whereas, and the one that's coming up in Georgia is a racketeer influenced and corrupt organization act case, we think, which again is a legitimate statute, but to apply it to this sort of thing, I think is a stretch. So we've got 3 where he's at risk with stretches of legal theories, and 1 in Florida, which, if they prove their case, it's not going to be good news for him.
Yeah. Now, also, the former President Trump today putting up on his Truth Social account, Bill Jacobsen, a legal insurrection, that he wants the Supreme Court to get involved in a legal battle, suggesting essentially that the DOJ going after him, Jack Smith going after him, is costing him a lot of money. And that's money and resources that he can't use for advertisements and rallies for his campaign. Legally speaking, is there any way that something like that were to get to the Supreme Court, or is that just commentary from the former president that has no basis in reality?
I think, anything can happen. Lightning sometimes strikes, but it's extremely unlikely that the Supreme Court would get involved in the scheduling of trials. That's usually left to district court judges. But this is an unusual circumstance. He would have to make a request to now, a state court and 4 district court, 2 state courts and 2 federal courts to hold things off until after the election. And would the Supreme Court or an appellate court, would an appeals court, or would the Supreme Court get involved where you have a major political candidate, possibly the nominee of a major party, being pursued by political opponents, 2 of whom at the state level promised to indict him on something, promised to get him, and the federal is under the control of his political opponent? Would the Supreme Court or an appeals court step in and say, look, you can't kneecap a political candidate, 2, 3, 4, 5 months with 4 trials before an election? We're going to issue a stay. We're not going to stop the trials, but you got to hold them. I don't know. This is unprecedented. This is new territory that we've never been in before, because indictments of candidates, generally speaking, don't happen in the run-up to a major election. So I don't think they would get involved. And the fact that it's costing them a lot of money is certainly not going to sway an appeals court, not for somebody who's a billionaire.
Do you think, Bill, can any of these get to the Supreme Court? Because part of my thinking here is that certain political actors want this to get to the Supreme Court, want the Supreme Court to bail out Trump to some degree, and then delegitimize the Supreme Court due to the fact that Donald Trump has appointed 3 of those members. Is that something that could end up happening with any of these cases, and if so, how?
Well, I think it's very unlikely that prior to the trial, an appeals court is going to get involved in any way. If he is convicted, then he would have the normal appeals process, and appeals courts reverse convictions. Okay. So, and, particularly where the convictions are based on flimsy legal theories, which is what, Jack Smith, the special counsel here, has become known for, getting his major convictions overturned on appeal because he stretched the legal theories. Now, you would hope a district court judge would not allow that to happen. So, Trump can make motions to the district court judges and the trial judges that these are not valid legal theories that they're pursuing me on. You'd hope he'd get a fair hearing. I don't know if he will, but the point is that the notion that the Supreme Court's going to jump in and micromanage these trials, again, I can't say it's impossible, but it's extraordinarily unlikely.
All right. So, Bill, what are you looking at then in terms of timeline on all this? I mean, we're 15 months away from an election. Obviously, Donald Trump has the lead in all these primary polls. Timeline-wise, what are we looking at here for all these things and how it could play out in the middle of this election cycle over the next 12-plus months?
Well, the first one that's on the schedule, I think Manhattan might be on the schedule, but that judge has already said that he would await the federal outcomes. So the realistic chance of the first trial is the end of May of next year in Florida, on the Florida case, which is the month before the convention, the Republican convention. Most of or all of the voting will have been completed. We could have a situation where there is new evidence that comes out at trial. Remember, the indictment in Florida doesn't have to be the totality of the prosecution's proof. It's just what they're alleging to support getting to a trial. And so, we could have a situation where people voted for Trump, hear what comes out at the trial, hear that it's much more substantial than they thought. It's not a hoax, so to speak, and say, wow, I wish I'd known that before I voted. Or you might have people who react the other way, who voted against Trump, and then the trial flops, and they say, "Oh my goodness, I would have voted for him." So, this is what's so crazy. This is why these things never should have been brought so close to an election.
It is going to be fascinating to follow. Bill Jacobsen, legalinsurrection.com, does great work over there. Bill, it's good to have you on in a different place, being here on WMAL in Washington, D.C. Thanks for your time. Thanks for the perspective, and have a great weekend.
Great. You too. Thanks.
All right. Well done there by Bill Jacobsen. I'm Pete Mundo, in for Vince Coglianese on a Friday afternoon on News Talk 105.9 WMAL, making sense of the news. That is such a good point. Where what about the people who might have changed their vote or might be changing their votes, depending on how the legal process plays out for the former president, who obviously is sitting here as the front runner right now? It's pretty unbelievable stuff. Now, somebody who's got no chance, less of a chance than Chris Christie, which is really less of a chance, is Asa Hutchinson, the former Arkansas governor. I got to give you a laugh going into the weekend. I was looking around clips for the show saying, geez, I got to find something. The news is so heavy. We got to get something to have a laugh here. Here we go. Cut 5, Asa Hutchinson, former Arkansas governor. He has not made the debate stage because you have a certain amount in the polls. You got to have a certain amount of donors. I think it's 40,000 donations overall. And Asa Hutchinson's not close. So his grand plan, the grand plan for Asa Hutchinson is he's going to make sure that MSNBC voters help him get on that debate stage. Cut 5.
Opportunity to say realistically what the chances are that you'll make that debate stage.
Well, we intend to make the debate stage. We have increased by 10,000 donors over the last couple of weeks. That's a big step forward, but it's all dependent upon your audience and others that can help us out to get there. But what will happen on that debate stage is, one, a contrast between Donald Trump.
Okay. When your grand plan to get on a debate stage of a Republican primary is to go on MSNBC and beg like you're PBS, get on your hands and knees and beg the audience to throw you a couple of bucks for a donation, you're hopeless. Chris Christie, we told you last hour, I just saw the headline that he's in Ukraine meeting with Zelensky, hoping to give himself a little boost. You got to give Christie this. At least he's going to a guy who's got billions of dollars, courtesy of us, by the way. That makes a little bit of sense, or at least it makes more sense than Asa Hutchinson deciding to go on MSNBC and try to shake down a couple of their viewers for a few bucks to get on the debate stage. I am glad, the RNC doesn't do much right, but I'm glad that they did put in these stipulations of polling and grassroots donations, so that way we don't have 17 people on the stage later this month. Whether or not Trump is there or not, I just have no interest in watching a bunch of guys and gals on a stage, the majority of whom have no chance, are wasting my time, and are simply furthering their own ambitions, whether it's in politics or outside of politics. Stop wasting the American people's time. And if a guy like Asa Hutchinson doesn't make the debate stage, well, you know what? Then the RNC did its job, as far as I'm concerned. Because nobody in their right mind is going to MSNBC as a Republican looking for donations. That's like me being short $5, and I go to my 4 or 2-year-old asking for some change. They don't have any. Unbelievable stuff. Unbelievable from Asa Hutchinson. Pete Mundo in for Vince Coglianese. 888-630-WMAL. That's 888-630-9625. We will get into in the final hour here on a Friday afternoon, because I know a lot of you are driving home thinking about happy hour. The debacle that has been Bud Light got a lot worse here, and we've got the numbers and also just the case study that is Bud Light. All coming up. Well, I'm just seeing this, and it's a fine point by Tim Scott, but the order matters. Good afternoon. I'm Pete Mundo out of Kansas City, in for Vince Coglianese on News Talk WMAL. Happy Friday afternoon. Thanks for joining us. So Tim Scott, just seeing this from the Associated Press here in the last, 2 minutes ago. Writing about how Tim Scott apparently talking about the fentanyl crisis and the epidemic that is obviously destroying poor, rich, black, white. It's permeating every community in this country, the fentanyl epidemic. And, I mean, every person who wants to be president should have to answer this, should have to figure out how you solve the problem. Now, the first thing, the obvious thing, the no-brainer thing to do is what? Close the border. Solve the border issue. That's number one. It's not going to create a perfect situation. It doesn't mean fentanyl's not going to be in the United States, but that's the number one thing. When you have a wide-open border, we know fentanyl's made in China, comes to Mexico, cartels blast it across the border, smuggle it across with women, children, everything else, and it's killing Americans by record numbers every single day. So that's the big thing. But Tim Scott said during a roundtable discussion that took place, and once again, this is just coming down from the Associated Press, he said here that we also have to be aware of the mental health crisis in a way that we don't fully embrace. He said during the pandemic, we saw 30 or 31% increases in parents bringing their young kids to the ER because of a mental health breakdown. And that is a symptom to a much bigger problem that we as a nation, we've got to become really honest about. Now, he's right. Mental health, as the headline notes, is important, does need to be addressed, not just the border. He's basically saying we've got to do both. I agree with Tim Scott on that. We have to do both. But if you don't do the border, if that's not the priority, then the mental health side, it's like whack-a-mole, right? If you don't do the border and you only do the mental health, and that's not what Tim Scott is saying, but I'm just making the point that until you do the border, nothing else matters. Because then you're just like, you're at the casino or you're at the county fair and you're playing whack-a-mole. You're not doing what needs to be done to really solve this problem or at least get it trending dramatically in the other direction, which is just not happening. And, of course, the people in charge have no interest in solving the border problem. We know that. Pete Mundo in for Vince Coglianese. Coming up, Bud Light, the case study that is. A lot's come out on that company over the last 24 hours. None of it good after a brutal second quarter. We'll have some fun with that coming up next. It's 5:34 on a Friday afternoon. Pete Mundo out of KCMO in Kansas City in for Vince Coglianese. Thanks for joining us. I know a lot of you are getting ready for the weekend. I'm here in Kansas City. It's not a bad day here. It's partly sunny, a little too humid. But it seems like you got a beautiful day there. 81 degrees, relatively low humidity. I usually come to town for a Radio Row event in mid-September. I've done that the last few years with the folks over at Fair, and that is, my goodness. I mean, every mid-September in your town inside the Beltway in D.C., it is just beautiful that time of year there. But it looks like you got a great summer Friday. And a lot of you, I'm sure, thinking about the weekend. Maybe you're off the happy hour, but I know a lot of folks in this audience, at least, are not going to get their Bud Light. Maybe you would have 6 months ago, 7 months ago, but that's no longer the case. So Bud Light puts out its second quarter numbers. And there have been so many case studies and just opinions and articles written about this over the last day. We now have the numbers. Anheuser-Busch released its latest earnings report, which showed that revenue fell 10.5%. They lost $395 million in U.S. sales. Of course, this ties back to the influencer campaign they ran with Dylan Mulvaney, a transgender person who, just happens to, really is a caricature of what Dylan thinks a woman is. I mean, I happen to be married to one, and let's just put it this way. I wouldn't be married, and most men would not be married to somebody who happens to act like Dylan Mulvaney does, because it's more like a caricature of what a guy thinks a woman acts like. It's not actually how women act. It's not any women I've been around. So with these numbers coming out, with the second quarter numbers, completely just falling off a cliff. My goodness, revenue's down 10.5%. Bud Light sales have been down anywhere from 25 to 30% consistently for the last several weeks. It's just not good. And meantime, Molson Coors reporting a 12% surge in net sales over the second quarter. So it's not like people stopped drinking beer. They just stopped drinking their Bud Light. They moved on to something else. And there was a really fascinating article that was written on this by Fox Business Network. And they talked to this guy, Harry Schumacher. He's with Beer Business Daily. He's the publisher. And he told Fox News Digital something that I didn't know. You know, I'm here in Kansas City, and Kansas City is, some people are in the Bud Light, but then some people despise Bud Light because it was St. Louis, right? So it was kind of, I'd say 60-40, Miller, Coors, Busch, and then, you know, Bud Light did get some love, but not a ton because some people just wanted to rag on St. Louis and didn't want to support St. Louis. But I didn't know this, that back in 2015, Anheuser-Busch moved its marketing and advertising teams from St. Louis to 24th Street in New York City. And what happened? Well, according to Beer Business Daily's Harry Schumacher, what happened then is that the company fell into a culture of what he calls checkbox marketing, where coastal elites in trendy Manhattan neighborhoods like Chelsea make decisions that will look good on LinkedIn as opposed to what's actually going to help sell beer. He told Fox Digital here, Anheuser-Busch made a conscious decision back in 2015 to move their sales and marketing functions to New York from St. Louis, where they had been headquartered for 100 years. At the time, distributors warned them that that might give them a bit of a hole in their thinking. It might give them gaps in connecting with middle America. And sure enough, it took almost a decade, but they figured out how not to connect with middle America. That's what happened to the brand. And this is one of those things that should be studied by marketing classes at the college level for generations to come. It won't because, you know, woke colleges don't want to do that. They don't have any interest in going down that road, so they won't do anything of that ilk. But if they actually want to teach kids how not to ruin an all-American brand, I would think that this Dylan Mulvaney Bud Light fiasco would be one that they would follow and study and look at. And if you're analyzing this from a historical context, because a lot of people try to remake history and rewrite history on this, it was never anti-trans. It was never about an anti-trans movement. Dylan Mulvaney was caught between traditional America and corporate America. Corporate America that for years, and it's gotten worse, obviously, the last 3, thanks to ESG and things like that, ESG investing, environmental social governance that has become a big deal on Wall Street with a lot of these Fortune 500 companies. But what really happened here is traditional America was trying to punch back. And they were kind of like, they were playing defense like Floyd Mayweather. They didn't have that Mike Tyson haymaker. They couldn't find it. They wanted it to be Nike with the Colin Kaepernick stuff going back years ago. There were always companies that kind of felt a little bit of something, but no one got the big haymaker. Bud Light comes along, makes this decision. Bud Light, to traditional Americans, is the light beer, was always the favorite light beer. And then, of course, the Mulvaney fiasco happens, and this is the opportunity. This is the opportunity for many of us, and I don't include myself because personally, I was always a Coors Light guy over a Bud Light guy. That's just me. But for people who are Bud Light drinkers, they said enough. This was their chance to send a message, not to Bud Light about transgender people, to send a message to corporate America that we've had enough. And it was an easy thing. This is much easier than a Target boycott, than a Nike boycott, than any of this stuff. Why? Because it's beer. Those of you that are leaving work today, it's 5:41 on a Friday, you're getting out of town, you're heading home from work, you're picking up your 6-pack. It is so easy to say, you know what, instead of the Bud Light, I'm going to the Coors Light. I'm going to the Miller Lite. I'm going to a craft beer. I'm going to a seltzer. Whatever you're going to do, you're going to something else. It's easy. It's not like Target where you've got food and clothes and house supplies. It's not like that. It's easy. And this was the chance for all of traditional America to slap corporate America in the face and say, stop with this. Just sell your dopey products, right? Sell your dopey products to us and leave politics out of it. None of us, I don't want any of my major American brands agreeing with me politically. I just don't want them involved. I want them far away. I want them to sell to the right, to the left, to the independent. I want them selling to everybody. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I care about with my brands. And I would imagine that's what many of you care about when it comes to your brands. And that's all we ever wanted from corporate America. That's it. 888-630-WMAL. 888-630-9625. Pete Mundo in Kansas City. I host mornings on KCMO Talk Radio in for Vince Coglianese. Appreciate you having me on this afternoon. But that's all most of us care about. Making sure that corporate America is not cramming left-wing politics down our throat. Just stay out of it. So that story about how Bud Light moved its marketing arm from St. Louis to New York City, that should go down as one of those things that you look at as a massive mistake. You should try to have as many people in the area that you're trying to sell beer. And St. Louis was perfect for them, not just because, of course, it's, the home of Anheuser-Busch before it got bought by this InBev company, but you're much closer to your people there than you are in Midtown Manhattan. Much closer. You're around the people. You're culturally more likely to be near them. It's easier access to them if you got to travel. That's what it's all about. And they made a massive mistake. And companies have made this mistake before, but this was next level. This was a $400 million mistake. And as Schumacher goes on to say to Fox News, that's the guy in this article that's quoted, Beer Business Daily publisher Harry Schumacher, he tells Fox, I think living in that kind of Chelsea, Manhattan bubble really does remove you from the bars and taverns, restaurants and convenience stores, grocery stores across America. And it definitely does have a cultural effect that you can't really measure, but it's definitely there. And he's right. I mean, ask, Donald Trump would say this when he was president. You've heard U.S. senators, other politicians say that. They like going out to other places and being with the people, being outside of the so-called Beltway that I know that many of you are working in and living in, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's great, but when you get out of it, there's a different feel in many parts of this country. And if you're running for elected office or you are in elected office, you need that. You have to do it. You've got to get out of bubbles. Whether you're executives at Bud Light selling that beer to middle America, or you're, a U.S. senator from where I'm at, Kansas, Missouri, or South Carolina, Texas, Montana, doesn't much matter. You have to get out of that bubble. And they totally didn't, and it's cost them hundreds of millions of dollars. Truly unbelievable stuff. Crazy. It has been a busy afternoon. The big story of the day, by the way, is the jobs report that came out this morning and came in under expectations. It wasn't a horrible report. Came in with 178,000 jobs added. That's below the estimation of about 200,000 jobs added. Unemployment rate ticked down to 3.5%. And that's one thing that the administration is bragging about. I mean, they are just doing cartwheels over this. Kamala Harris was in Washington, D.C. today giving a speech. And let's roll, they're all brutal to listen to, but let's roll cut 3. Kamala Harris from earlier today, very happy with this unemployment report.
All that, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else, that is called Bidenomics. That is called Bidenomics, and we are very proud of Bidenomics.
I don't understand. Why is she always laughing? Somebody explain to me why she's always laughing at something that's not funny. I mean, it's just so weird. It's like out of Veep. It's bizarre. So anyway, you know what else is Bidenomics? Unemployment's low. That's true. Why is that? People are not getting back into the labor force still. There is still a dearth of people in the labor force. And once you're out of the labor force for a certain amount of months, what happens? You don't count against the unemployment rate. And by the way, if you go to Main Street, do you think anybody cares about the unemployment rate? Or do you think they're like, gosh, I'm short on workers. I go to the grocery store. It's costing me another 20%, it feels like. I'm now going to the gas station. It's costing me now $4 a gallon. Not happy about that. But what also is Bidenomics is the labor force participation rate, which sits right now at 62.6%. It has been steady at that number going back to March. Hasn't budged. 62.6%. Pre-COVID, we were at 63.3%. Now, you might say, well, what are we talking about? Not even 1%, right? 0.75 of a point. What's the big? I mean, we're talking millions of jobs, right? It's still millions of jobs. And before COVID, we had the highest labor participation rate we had in almost 10 years at 6.3% under President Trump. Then it falls off a cliff during COVID, and we've slowly been building it back up. But for an administration that likes to brag about Bidenomics, that likes to brag about the great job, oh, man, people are living high on the hog, life is good. No, and this is case in point. This right here is a prime example of it. And earlier today, Steve Leishman, CNBC, here's what he had to say about workforce participation that is not improving, and it needs to be. Cut 7.
We cannot seem to get or budge off. We had a nice ride up on the participation rate, and now it's flatline. We can't seem to get more people into the workforce. And then this will be a topic of debate. It may take a higher wage. It may be what the issue has been is older folks who have left the workforce and not come back. There's always this flow back from the 55 or 65 and older crowd. They've not come back, and we don't know exactly why or what it would take to make that happen.
Well, that was Steve Leishman, CNBC, trying to figure out why the labor participation rate is not budging. It's not budging. I mean, I know he's the fancy economist on CNBC, and I'm just the guy with the microphone here doing a radio show. But it's not budging because you still have economic policy dating back to COVID that is encouraging. It's not a safety net anymore. It's encouraging people not to work. I'm all about a safety net. I get it. First world countries need safety nets and should have safety nets. We're way beyond a safety net. Way beyond it. And yes, there are people, of course, who, in the wake of COVID, stopped working and didn't have to go back to work, retirees and whatnot. But that's not what this is about right now. You have had policy for the better part of 3.5 years that encouraged people and rewarded people for not getting off the couch. And as this labor shortage continues, what do people, or what do you hear from many on the left on this? Well, you see, this is why we need our friends to flood the southern border. They got to come across the border, and we got to get people into the labor force. There's plenty of people who are sitting around and not working. Able-bodied men are not working like they should be in the labor force. And that's a major problem right now. That's not getting nearly enough attention. Millions of men have dropped out of the workforce, and companies are struggling to get them back in. They don't know how to do it. 7 million men is the latest numbers I've seen of able-bodied young men who are not in the labor force between 25 and 54, just sitting it out. What do you do about that? That's got to change. That's got to change not just to fix the economy, but societally speaking. You got to get that number back on track. You have to get these guys back in the labor force through strong economic policy that encourages people to go to work, be proud of what they do, and make a difference for their community and their country every single day, and find that passion that they have. Because, boy, do we need it. I don't know about you, but you try to find a plumber in Kansas City, an electrician in Kansas City, they'll see you in 2 weeks. It's crazy. Unbelievable. We've got a few minutes left with you. It is 5:51 Jobs report out today came in under expectations. Labor participation remains stagnant, well below where it was during the pre-COVID times. Garrett in Northern Virginia, a minute, and it is yours. Garrett, go ahead. Pete Mundo in for Vince Coglianese on WMAL. What do you got?
Hi, Pete. Well, I was just thinking about what you were saying, and it seems like I have some friends that are in the 55 to 60 range with advanced degrees, PhDs. They can't get work because they're overqualified. They get told this over and over again: you're overqualified, you're overqualified, and they want to hire people that are right out of college, to have mushy minds, fit into the liberal suit just perfectly, and will do what they're told. The older people are wise.
Here's Garrett. I totally agree, and I appreciate the call. What they've got to do, run for office. I say it tongue-in-cheek, but I'm also serious. Like, that's what every other geriatric apparently is doing. Unbelievable. All right. Thank you to Vince Coglianese for letting me sit in the chair for the day. Thanks to Bill Hess, Kevin Tober, Dave Kimber holding it back down in the studio. I'm Pete Mundo. Find me on Twitter at Pete Mundo. I do mornings on KCMO in Kansas City. Have a great weekend, Washington, D.C. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.